tires screech, a scream pierces the morning calm, and Karen's SUV storms up our private road, hell-bent on chaos. But when she meets our gate and our resolve, her reign of HOA terror faces its ultimate test. This is the story of a fence that didn't just mark a boundary, it stopped a tyrant. It started with a sound that could wake the dead, tires spinning wildly on gravel, followed by a high-pitched scream that shattered the peaceful morning like a plate flung against a wall in rage. "You better come out now or I swear I'll sue your face off." I had just handed my wife her coffee when Karen's SUV, which looked like it had just bulldozed its way through a JCPenney clearance rack, came barreling up the private road that only 2 people on Earth had a legal right to use. And she wasn't one of them. She parked crookedly across our driveway, half on the native grass I'd reseeded for months, and half on our gravel path, like she was intentionally trying to offend nature. She threw open the door, nearly smacked a tree, and came stomping in flip-flops like she was about to audition for an exorcism. Her sunglasses perched high like a tiara of entitlement. My wife didn't even flinch. She calmly sipped her coffee and muttered, "And so it begins." I was still in my robe, holding a spatula with one pancake left on the griddle, wondering if this was the most ridiculous standoff in cabin history or the beginning of something far more absurd. Karen's voice pitched again as she pointed at our porch like it had personally insulted her, shouting something about community bylaws, property lines, and how we were violating visual peace. My wife stood up, walked toward the heavy steel gate, and without breaking eye contact, closed it with a loud echoing clang. Then she locked it. Karen froze like someone had just whispered a secret that cracked her version of reality. I watched as she realized for the first time she wasn't the one holding the leash anymore. My wife lifted her phone, called the sheriff, and calmly said, "Hi, yes, there's a woman trespassing again." Same SUV, same screaming, different shade of crazy. I could see Karen's expression trying to compute the math between her imagined authority and our actual property line. And that's when I knew this wasn't just a tantrum. It was war. It hadn't always been like this. When we bought the cabin 6 months ago, tucked away in the pine-covered slopes of a non-HOA mountain zone, the biggest concern we had was whether we'd have enough firewood to last the winter. We'd paid in full, double-checked the legal access rights, surveyed the land 3 times, and made sure every inch was outside the ridiculous HOA boundary Karen presided over like a mall cop with delusions of a federal badge. The listing had even warned no HOA jurisdiction. That was why we bought it. And somehow that's why Karen hated us, because she couldn't touch us. She tried from day one. Left passive-aggressive notes about the color of our porch furniture. Said we were violating community spirit by having solar panels that didn't match the cabin aesthetic, which wasn't even her cabin to begin with. She owned the nearest property half a mile down the slope, still technically within the HOA border. And yet, she decided that our happiness must be regulated. The sheriff had already visited twice in the past month over false reports she filed, accusing us of noise pollution from the sound of wind chimes and of constructing a fence that disrespected the mountain's visual integrity. Both times the sheriff apologized on her behalf, but you could see the embarrassment sinking deeper into his wrinkles each time he had to hear her yell about my authority as a founding board member. So today, when she came screeching up the road like her SUV was powered by rage and broken dreams, I wasn't even surprised, just annoyed I hadn't installed popcorn holders on the porch. She ranted about a gate violation, claiming we had blocked public passage, which made my wife laugh out loud because the road had been privately owned for over 50 years. I opened the property folder we always kept by the fireplace just in case the circus rolled up again, flipping to the deed and the survey map like it was a well-rehearsed routine. Karen, refusing to look at it, shoved her phone in my face and screamed, "I'll have you fined for hostile landscaping." I didn't even know what that meant. Was it because we planted native shrubs instead of HOA-approved geraniums? My wife stepped forward, standing a full inch taller than Karen, even in bare feet, and said with a calm, lethal edge, "Karen, you are on private land without permission after 2 written warnings. You just blocked our driveway. The sheriff is en route, and this time we're pressing charges." Karen blinked like she had just realized her cheat codes weren't working anymore. That's when I noticed something deliciously ironic. She had left her car parked entirely inside our gate line. My wife followed my gaze and I saw the tiniest twitch of a smile form on her lips. The kind that says revenge was never improvised but patiently planned. The sheriff arrived 30 minutes later. Karen had moved from yelling to pacing, trying to call someone higher up. Maybe the HOA president, maybe her yoga instructor. Hard to tell with all the shrieking. Sheriff Davis stepped out of his cruiser with the patience of a man who'd seen far worse, but had never quite seen a woman accuse someone of stealing mountain ambience. My wife handed him the gate camera footage showing Karen barreling up the drive, trespassing, screaming threats, and parking with the grace of a shopping cart on a ski slope. He sighed, rubbed his temple, and muttered something about retirement. Karen tried the usual routine, fake tears, claims of harassment, insisting that we had lured her here with malicious intent. Sheriff Davis said plainly, "Ma'am, you're on private property again without invitation. There are no violations here. You are, however, liable for trespassing and obstruction." When he mentioned a possible fine and a court date, Karen's voice climbed to a frequency known only to bats. She claimed the road was historically communal, that her grandfather once drove cattle through it in the 60s, and that it was spiritually hers. My wife leaned on the gate and replied dryly, "Then your spirit needs to leave our driveway." The sheriff, attempting diplomacy, asked Karen to move her car. That's when the true beauty of the situation hit her. The gate was locked. She was on the inside, and we weren't unlocking it. "You fenced me in?" she shrieked. "Not yet," I replied, voice casual. "But I might." I glanced at the post-hole digger and the rolls of fencing we had ready for an upcoming project. Karen paled. Sheriff Davis tried not to smile. "Technically," he said, "you can't fence her in intentionally, but if you're building a legal fence on your land and her car is in the way, well, that's unfortunate." My wife turned and walked toward the shed without a word. Karen called after her, voice trembling, "You wouldn't dare." My wife looked over her shoulder and said with the calm of someone selecting dessert, "I would, and I am." That moment, the silence, the sheriff frozen mid-step, Karen gasping like she'd swallowed a pine cone. It was theater. You could smell the fear radiating off her SUV. We didn't start installing the fence that day. Not yet. That would come soon enough. But the seed had been planted, and Karen knew it. She tried begging, bargaining, even offered to bring over banana bread like that would erase months of lunacy. But this wasn't about banana bread. This was about boundaries, both physical and moral, and for the first time in her. The morning after Karen's meltdown, the forest returned to its peaceful rhythm. But a faint tension lingered in the air like the smell of wood smoke after a fire. My wife and I sat on the porch sipping coffee as the sun filtered through the trees in lazy golden beams, and we both knew it was only a matter of time before the next move. Karen was the type who didn't retreat easily. She reloaded in silence and came back louder. Sure enough, by midday, we received a formal letter slipped into our mailbox and signed, printed in blocky Times New Roman, and brimming with misused legal terminology. It accused us of obstruction of community access, malicious fencing intent, public endangerment, and in a bizarre twist, spiritual harassment against the mountain. It demanded immediate removal of all gates and a formal apology to the HOA board, which of course didn't govern our land. My wife read it out loud in a dramatic court voice imitation while I grilled lunch. She ended with a mock gasp and tossed it into the burned barrel with a flourish. We both knew that Karen wouldn't stop at letters. Her obsession with controlling things she didn't own had mutated into something bigger. Now it wasn't just about the land. It was about pride. Her pride had been shattered when she realized she couldn't force her rules onto a place outside her reach. And now she was trying to rewrite reality one tantrum at a time. That afternoon, Sheriff Davis returned. This time, not due to a call from us, but because Karen had filed an official report accusing us of malicious land encroachment and threatening behavior. He stepped out of his cruiser, hat in hand, wearing the look of a man already regretting his job. "You folks busy?" he asked, eyeing the tools by the shed and the small pile of fencing supplies we hadn't touched yet. "Not particularly," I replied, wiping my hands on a towel. My wife offered him lemonade, and he accepted with a nod of gratitude that felt more spiritual than physical. We sat under the porch as he explained that Karen had submitted old black and white photos claiming the road was part of a historic cattle route, that the community bylaws, again, which didn't apply to us, gave her authority to regulate visual and vehicular aesthetics within 1,000 feet of the HOA's edge, and that our gate's color violated the rustic harmony clause. The sheriff sighed, shaking his head as he added. She even attached a map with crayon lines. I wish I were joking. My wife, ever composed, stood up and went inside. When she returned, she carried a thick manila folder and handed it to the sheriff. That's every legal document related to our purchase, she said. Property deed, surveyor's map, access rights, title insurance, historical aerial images, and 2 legal opinions from a land use attorney confirming we're outside the HOA jurisdiction by a full half-mile. The sheriff flipped through it slowly, nodding with genuine admiration. You really came prepared, he murmured. My wife simply smiled and said, we read the listing description. No HOA, that wasn't a suggestion. It was a promise. But even the sheriff's understanding of the law wouldn't stop Karen from twisting reality. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. We found fake violation notices nailed to our fence, stamped with a forged HOA logo. Lawn care service trucks we hadn't hired began appearing at the gate, claiming they were scheduled for monthly regulation trimming. One morning, a teenager in a polo shirt approached us with a clipboard and asked if we had signed up for mandatory cabin inspections. My wife asked him which agency had sent him. He fumbled, said Mountain View HOA Enforcement Committee, and when pressed for ID, mumbled an apology and fled down the driveway. We caught the entire interaction on video. That night, my wife uploaded the footage to a private online community board we'd quietly joined, one that included other landowners around the HOA's edge, who had also reported bizarre run-ins with Karen. The replies poured in. She did the same thing to us last spring, wrote a neighbor a few miles west. Tried to fine us for having a trampoline. We're not even in her district. Another user shared a PDF titled HOA Harassment Pattern Report complete with timestamps, screenshots, and letters matching the exact wording we'd received. It was like discovering a secret network of people who had been quietly battling the same storm. But now, thanks to Karen's overreach, we had become united under a common banner of irritation and legal fury. The next morning, we printed out a large aerial map of the area with every legal property boundary color-coded and highlighted. My wife laminated it and posted it on our gate with a note. For anyone confused, this is where your authority ends, and this is where our patience did. We watched from the kitchen window as Karen drove past slowly, squinting at the map with the pained look of someone being told gravity wasn't optional. That evening, we had another surprise. A certified letter from a law office showed up. Karen had retained legal representation. The envelope was thick, filled with accusations ranging from aesthetic vandalism to emotional pollution of community spirit. It read like a bad satire novel, but nestled among the absurdity was a line that caught my eye. It claimed that Karen was in possession of historic rights of ingress due to a long-defunct cattle path that once curved vaguely near our property over 60 years ago. I blinked, rereading it twice, then passed it to my wife, who arched an eyebrow and muttered, "So now she's invoking ghost cows." We immediately contacted our attorney, who laughed so hard on the phone he had to put us on hold. When he returned, he assured us that such claims were laughable in modern property law unless she had easement rights recorded in the county. And she didn't. We even pulled the records ourselves just to be sure. Not a single shred of easement, right-of-way, or shared access agreement anywhere in the archives. Our land was isolated, purchased clean, and free of strings. Karen's claim was built entirely on desperation and audacity. The following morning, my wife had a brilliant idea. She walked into town and returned with a handmade wooden sign carved by a local artist. It read, "Private property, not under HOA jurisdiction. Do not engage in delusional governance." She placed it on a post just inside the gate, angled slightly toward the road. We watched from inside as Karen returned later that day with a clipboard, squinted at the sign for a long time, then took a photo with her phone, and drove off. That night, we installed a new camera above the gate with night vision and motion alert. At 2 o'clock in the morning, it pinged. Karen had returned on foot, wearing a hoodie and gloves. She crept toward the sign, tried to pry it loose, then spotted the red blinking light and bolted back into the woods like a raccoon with a guilty conscience. We didn't even need to call the sheriff this time. The footage was crystal clear. The next day, we forwarded it to Davis along with a cheerful message. Subject attempting unauthorized removal of humorous signage. He replied with a single line. Y'all are quickly becoming my favorite cabin owners. Still, even as we laughed, we knew Karen's next move would be bigger, more desperate. Her pattern was clear. Humiliation turned to aggression. Aggression turned to retaliation, and retaliation in Karen's world usually came in the form of legal theater and public outbursts. We decided to preempt her. 3 days after Karen's midnight attempt at unauthorized sign removal, we began constructing the fence. Not because we needed to keep her out. She already knew better than to step foot beyond the gate without triggering legal consequences, but because we wanted to send a message that could be seen from 100 yards away and understood even by someone who believed HOA bylaws outranked the Constitution. The fence wasn't just a structure. It was a declaration. We didn't build it out of spite. We built it out of tiredness, out of resolve, out of the simple desire to enjoy our own land without having to look over our shoulders for a woman holding a clipboard and breathing heavily through a forced smile. The materials had been waiting for weeks. Metal posts, wooden panels, and welded wire strong enough to contain cattle or, in this case, delusional entitlement. It took half a day just to measure and mark the perimeter. And as we worked, we noticed a familiar vehicle slowing down at the curve near our property. Karen was back, not on foot this time, but parked just beyond the property line, watching with binoculars like we were rare birds building a nest made of court filings. She stayed for over an hour, her engine off, her presence loud despite the silence. My wife gave her a casual wave, which Karen didn't return. Instead, she raised her phone and took photos from every angle she could manage from her awkward perch in the weeds. By the end of day 1, we had completed one full side of the fence and deliberately saved the gate-facing section for last. Not because it was harder. If anything, it was the easiest stretch, but because we knew what was coming, and we wanted it timed perfectly. The next morning, sure enough, Karen returned, this time with a man in tow. He was dressed in slacks and a tie like he had mistaken the woods for a courtroom, holding a leather briefcase that looked more decorative than useful. She gestured wildly as they approached the gate, and he began shouting over the fence in what he clearly thought was his most authoritative voice. He claimed we were constructing an illegal barrier on shared-use land, that we were interfering with potential emergency access, and that by trapping her vehicle, still parked just inside our gate line, we had violated open road doctrine. I held up a hand, interrupted his speech, and calmly asked, "What state are you licensed in?" He blinked, caught off guard, then stammered. I'm acting in a community legal advisory role." My wife leaned on the fence post and said, "So, not a lawyer." "Got it." She reached into her pocket and pressed play on her phone, recording the exchange. The man immediately shifted his tone, muttered something about defamation, and walked back to Karen's SUV while she stood frozen in disbelief. "You fenced in my car," she shrieked. "You deliberately constructed a barrier around my property." My wife replied. "Your car is not property if it's illegally placed on someone else's. It's evidence." We continued working panel by panel. The fence rose. At one point, Karen's SUV began honking. The horn a sharp burst of panic as if the sound could reverse the logic of land ownership. But we ignored it. The sheriff had already confirmed we were legally entitled to fence our land. Her vehicle being inside it was not our fault. It was her poor choice. We even left a clear, unlocked walking path out toward the main road. Plenty of opportunity for Karen to remove her car if she wished. But of course, she didn't want to remove it. She wanted us to break some rule to give her the upper hand again. But we had read every rule, every code, every footnote in the zoning law. And we built carefully, patiently, legally. That night, when the final gate-facing section went up, we didn't celebrate with loud music or dramatic gestures. We simply stood back, admired the craftsmanship, and smiled. The fence was elegant, practical, and undeniable. It didn't scream rebellion. It whispered quiet defiance. But Karen wasn't done. The next morning, she returned again. Only this time, she was on the phone with someone, pacing outside the gate and yelling so loudly that even the birds grew quiet. She was calling a tow truck. Her voice rang out. Yes, I need my car extracted from a hostile enclosure. Yes, it's been trapped by neighbors who are violating federal road laws. She gave them our address, then rattled off a list of crimes that made it sound like we were running a prison camp. 40 minutes later, the tow truck arrived. The driver stepped out, scratched his head, and walked up to the gate where I met him with a warm smile. "You got a car for removal?" he asked. "Technically, yes," I said. "But it's on private property behind a locked gate with clear signage and video surveillance." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I figured." She wasn't real clear on the phone. Said something about fences and emergency declarations. Karen stormed forward and barked. "Just tow the damn thing out." The driver calmly shook his head and said, "Ma'am, I don't trespass." "Not for $50. Not for 500. You'll need a court order to get me past that gate." Karen looked ready to explode. She hissed through gritted teeth. "They're illegally detaining my car." I said, "Actually, it's just parked where it shouldn't be. You're welcome to drive it out. Just remove the gate, which you'll need our permission to open." The driver climbed back into his truck, muttering something about needing hazard pay for dealing with HOA drama, and rolled back down the hill. That evening, just as the sun dipped low and cast golden shadows over the woods, we noticed another car slowly creeping up the road. It was unmarked, black, and far too clean to belong to a local. A man stepped out wearing khakis and a golf shirt, holding a clipboard, and walking with the cautious confidence of someone who thought he was the smartest in the room before reading it. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice nasal and official. "I'm from the county planning office." My wife nodded. "Interesting. We didn't request an inspection." He cleared his throat and said, "We received an anonymous tip regarding illegal construction." I raised an eyebrow. "The fence?" He glanced at the structure behind us, then at his clipboard and said, "It's been alleged that the fence obstructs county drainage flow." I nearly laughed. We were on a hill. No drainage ran through here, unless you counted the occasional squirrel stream. My wife calmly walked to the file box near the porch, pulled out the stamped permit for non-permanent fencing on private land, and handed it to him. He squinted at it, nodded reluctantly, and said, "Well, looks like you're clear." We watched him drive off, not even bothering to hide his annoyance. Karen, who had been lurking behind a pine tree like a raccoon in lipstick, slinked back to her vehicle and disappeared once again. And just when we thought we'd seen the peak of madness, the next morning brought a delivery truck to our address. Carrying 3 pallets of landscaping rock, we hadn't ordered anything. The driver asked us where we wanted them dumped. We asked who paid for them. He handed us the invoice, and sure enough, Karen's name was on it. She had apparently tried to bury our driveway in decorative stone, claiming she was. The fence had turned into more than just a boundary. It had become a monument, a psychological barrier that Karen could neither climb nor comprehend. As the days passed, she tried different tactics to regain control. She went quiet for 2 mornings, then suddenly reappeared with a drone that buzzed over our cabin like an angry mechanical hornet. It hovered in place near the gate, tilted its tiny camera toward the porch, and whirred around like it was trying to intimidate us with slow-motion surveillance. My wife didn't even flinch. She stepped off the porch with a tennis racket, aimed like she was returning a serve at Wimbledon, and the drone swerved upward at the last second as if it knew it was one swing away from being a pile of shattered plastic in the bushes. I smiled and waved at the camera, knowing full well who was behind the remote control. 10 minutes later, Karen's SUV appeared again. And this time, she didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She just stood there beyond the fence, her arms crossed as if hoping silence alone could unnerve us. My wife pulled out her phone and started playing smooth jazz through a Bluetooth speaker, leaning back in her chair and letting the music drift into the forest air like incense. Karen stood for 5 full minutes, visibly seething at the lack of reaction, then finally stomped back to her car and slammed the door so hard it set off her own alarm. But the real unraveling began the next afternoon when a package arrived by courier. It was from a local law firm, not the pretend legal rep she brought earlier, but an actual attorney. The letter was long, dramatic, and drenched in theatrical vocabulary. It accused us of false imprisonment of a vehicle, malicious intent to humiliate a community figure, slander by signage, and most laughably, psychological warfare by construction. It demanded we remove the fence immediately or face a lawsuit for damages to reputation and property. My wife read the entire thing out loud with a wine glass in hand and paused every few paragraphs to dramatically gasp or chuckle. I asked her if we should respond formally, but she shook her head and said, "No, not yet. Let her swing first. She doesn't know we've been filming everything." And it was true. Every visit, every trespass, every shouted accusation, it was all recorded. Motion sensors, trail cams, porch security feeds. We had more footage of Karen than a wildlife documentary had of mountain lions. Still, this latest escalation meant we had to be ready for more than just yelling. We had to be ready for legal games. So, the next morning, we drove into town and visited the county clerk's office. We filed a formal incident report cataloging every encounter, attached timestamps and GPS logs from our camera systems, and made copies of our survey map with the fence lines clearly marked. Then, we dropped by the sheriff's office with a thumb drive containing the latest footage, including the drone harassment and the fake delivery incident. Sheriff Davis watched the clip silently, occasionally sighing, and finally leaned back in his chair, saying, "I'm going to need popcorn if this keeps up." Then he added, more seriously, "You two are doing everything right. Keep your cameras on. Stay within your boundaries, literally. And if she steps foot past that fence again, call me directly." We thanked him and returned to the cabin more confident than ever. We weren't just building fences now. We were building evidence. The following weekend, something strange happened. A silver luxury car pulled into the edge of our road and parked quietly. Out stepped a tall, well-dressed man with a leather briefcase. He walked up to the fence and waited, looking around like he wasn't quite sure what he was walking into. I approached, keeping the fence between us, and asked how I could help. He introduced himself as an attorney representing the HOA and said he was hoping for a peaceful discussion. My wife joined me at the gate, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He explained that Karen had recently escalated some concerns to the board and claimed we were threatening community unity and creating hostile division in the neighborhood. He then said in a low voice, "We've reviewed the property records. We know your land is outside the HOA, but Karen's been a loud voice on the board for years, and she's made this personal." I tilted my head. "So, why are you here?" He hesitated, then replied to ask if you'd consider removing the fence voluntarily, just the section around her car as a gesture of goodwill. My wife smiled slow and deliberate. "So, the HOA wants to reward trespassing with forgiveness?" The man didn't answer. He just looked tired, like someone forced to clean up a mess they didn't make. "I'm not threatening you," he said carefully. "But if she sues, it'll get loud. Even if she loses." My wife stepped closer to the fence, her tone cool and cutting. "Let her. The louder she gets, the worse she looks. We've documented everything. If she wants court, she's walking into a cage she welded herself." The man gave a slow nod, as if accepting defeat before he even tried, and walked back to his car. We didn't hear from him again. That night, we hosted our first bonfire. We invited a few nearby landowners who had messaged us through the online board. People who had also been harassed, threatened, fined for invented violations. They arrived with folding chairs and drinks, some bringing food, others just stories. We sat in a circle as the fire crackled, laughing over Karen's greatest hits, the wind chime incident, the sidewalk shade complaint, the Christmas lights that allegedly caused optical disruption to woodland creatures. One man brought a framed HOA violation letter that said his porch rug was aggressively patterned. Another shared how Karen once demanded a neighbor repaint a deck because it clashed with mountain tones during the solstice. It was absurd and it was unifying. For the first time since moving here, we felt part of something bigger. A quiet resistance to nonsense. A shared understanding that logic, humor, and a solid fence were all it took to defeat tyranny in yoga pants. The next morning, just as the smoke from the fire pit still lingered in the air, we heard a familiar shriek from down the slope. Karen had returned to find her SUV entirely enclosed by the finished fence, complete with a fresh coat of paint and a sign that read, "Unauthorized parking will be contained." Her scream echoed off the trees, primal and broken, as if the reality of her own mistake had finally hit her all at once. She paced around the perimeter, tried the gate, realized it was locked, then spotted the sign, and turned redder than a campfire ember. She tried calling someone, probably the same lawyer who had already walked away from the mess, then stormed off again, disappearing into the woods behind her car, like she was hoping to find an emotional escape route through the pine needles. But the breaking point wasn't the fence or the drone or even the sign. It came 2 days later when my wife posted a short video clip from the bonfire night to the private community forum. It showed the fire, the group laughing and someone toasting with the words "to fences and freedom." Within an hour, the post went viral inside the network. People from all over the county began commenting. Stories poured in. Memes were made. Someone created a parody account called The Silence lasted a total of 48 hours, a record by Karen's standards before she launched what would go down as her most theatrical, unhinged, and ultimately self-destructive performance yet. By now, the community forum was flooded with parodies. The sheriff had grown visibly weary of her name, and the HOA board was crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny and internal embarrassment. But Karen, fueled by a cocktail of desperation and ego, refused to accept the unraveling of her manufactured authority. She couldn't sit back and watch the very people she once manipulated toast marshmallows beside a fence she couldn't penetrate. So, she did what any pride-wounded tyrant might do. She tried to sneak back onto our land under cover of darkness to retrieve her car, even though the sheriff had explicitly warned her that any attempt to bypass the legal process would lead to charges. It was just after 2 a.m. when our motion sensors lit up the forest like a low-budget alien invasion. My phone buzzed, pinging one alert after another as the cameras switched from night mode to floodlight-enhanced clarity. There she was, hunched low, wrapped in a dark hoodie, cutting through brush and dodging trees like she thought she was in a spy thriller instead of trespassing across property lines clearly marked with reflective tape and no less than 4 laminated signs. She approached the fence near the rear boundary far from the main gate and began tugging at the welded panels like she was auditioning for a role as an amateur escape artist. My wife, already awake and calmly sipping herbal tea in the kitchen like she had sensed this moment coming, handed me my phone and said, "You might want to dial Davis. She's going full nocturnal." I placed the call. Sheriff Davis answered on the second ring with a groggy, but unsurprised, "Please tell me it's not her again." I confirmed that it was, and within 20 minutes, his cruiser rolled up the gravel drive with its headlights off, quiet and deliberate. We watched from the porch as he walked along the fence line and found her crouched by the rear corner, screwdriver in hand, tugging futilely at a bracket she clearly didn't understand how to detach. His flashlight beam froze her like a deer in denial. She tried to run but tripped over a root and face-planted into the dirt with a loud thud that echoed through the trees. Davis calmly approached, told her to stay down, and called for backup. She shouted something about wrongful entrapment, false imprisonment of property, and spiritual persecution. He ignored her rant and read her the trespass code like a bored professor reviewing a failed student's final paper. Backup arrived soon after, and she was escorted off the property in handcuffs, her face streaked with dirt and tears, still muttering about conspiracies and witch hunts. Her SUV, of course, remained right where it was, still inside our fence, still perfectly untouched, still the symbolic tombstone of her failure. The next day, the sheriff filed an official incident report with enough detail to make a novelist blush. Included were the timestamps, photos, and even a direct quote from Karen's midnight ramblings where she shouted, "You can't trap me in a box of steel and arrogance." The local paper got wind of the story, probably from one of the deputies who couldn't stop laughing, and ran a short column titled, "Trespass Attempt Self-Rescue Fails Dramatically." It wasn't exactly Pulitzer-worthy, but it lit a fuse in the community. Neighbors started contacting us directly. One older couple who lived on the opposite ridge sent us fresh-baked bread and a handwritten note that simply said, "Thank you for defending our sanity." Another neighbor dropped off a bottle of wine with a tag that read, "For the best fence builders this side of the county line." But it wasn't the praise that mattered. It was the validation that we weren't crazy. That Karen's madness had infected the community for years, and that finally someone had forced her to face consequences she couldn't manipulate or scream her way out of. Still, even with her arrest, we knew the battle wasn't completely over. Karen posted bail the next morning and returned home with her head high and her sunglasses larger than ever, as if hoping to pretend none of it had happened. She didn't come near the cabin, but her presence could be felt like an electrical storm on the horizon. And sure enough, 4 days later, a court summons arrived in the mail. Karen was suing us for intentional infliction of emotional distress, unlawful detainment of private vehicle, and malicious public defamation. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. My wife calmly set the letter aside and said, "Good. I've been waiting for her to walk into a courtroom with this circus act." We spent the next few days assembling our case. Footage, documents, sheriff statements, community testimonials. We even had timestamps proving that the fence had been completed days before her attempted removal and that her car was parked illegally from the start. It wasn't a case, it was a display. All we had to do was hit play. On the morning of the court date, the room was packed tighter than a Sunday pancake breakfast. Local press were there. So were a few neighbors. And sitting in the back row with a smirk that could slice steel was Sheriff Davis, arms folded, waiting to see how it would unfold. Karen sat beside her attorney, one she had clearly hired in desperation because the poor man looked like he regretted every decision that had brought him to this courtroom. The judge, a silver-haired woman with the no-nonsense energy of someone who had seen too many fake lawsuits and not enough common sense, called the session to order. Karen's lawyer opened with a dramatic monologue about psychological harm and property rights. My wife let him finish, then stood up, requested permission to present video evidence, and plugged in a flash drive. The courtroom went silent as footage rolled. Karen screaming, blocking our driveway, pounding on the gate, creeping through the woods at 2 a.m., shouting about spiritual warfare against fences. Laughter broke out more than once, which earned a warning glare from the judge. When it ended, the courtroom was still, except for Karen's attorney slowly burying his face in his hands. The judge leaned forward and said, "So, the vehicle in question was parked inside their gate on their land without permission?" Karen tried to speak, but the judge held up a hand. "Was it forcibly moved or tampered with?" Another shake of the head. "Did they notify law enforcement during each encounter?" The nod from Sheriff Davis was almost ceremonial. The judge sighed, removed her glasses, and said, "This is not a lawsuit. This is a tantrum. Case dismissed." The gavel came down like thunder, and just like that, it was over. Karen stormed out of the courtroom, cameras flashing, her name whispered like a ghost in a town tired of her shadow. That evening, the HOA board released an official statement. Karen was permanently removed from her position, her voting privileges revoked, and an internal audit was underway to undo the damage she had inflicted over the years. It wasn't just a win, it was a reckoning. It had been a week since the courtroom fiasco and the official notice from the HOA board removing Karen from every position she ever weaponized. And though her presence had dulled into something distant and almost theatrical, we weren't naive enough to think she had disappeared completely. There's something about a person like Karen, someone who builds their entire identity on control that doesn't just retreat into the shadows when the control slips away. They linger, watching, planning, waiting for some opening to reclaim even a sliver of authority. But the landscape had changed. She wasn't feared anymore. She was laughed at. The community that had once tiptoed around her temper now used her name in memes and running jokes. And neighbors that used to ignore each other now bonded over shared war stories at the general store and the farmer's market. And as for us, the fence was just the beginning. After the court ruling, we doubled down, not in retaliation, but in reinvestment. We added solar-powered lights along the perimeter, motion-activated spotlights by the gate, and a small wooden sign at the end of the driveway that read, "Serenity begins here." It wasn't a warning. It was a promise that this land, hard-earned and hard-defended, would remain untouched by delusion. Then came the celebration. Not our idea, but the community's. One of the neighbors we met during the bonfire, a retired carpenter named Greg, showed up with a handwritten invitation to a backyard gathering at his place. An unofficial neighborhood potluck/liberation party titled, and I quote, "The Freedom from Karen Festival." At first, we laughed it off, assuming it was just his way of blowing off steam. But within 3 days, the invitation had made the rounds, and we realized something extraordinary was happening. People we barely knew were dropping off food, lawn chairs, extra coolers. Someone brought a projector. Someone else made custom t-shirts that said things like, "Fences, fines, and no trespassing means you, Karen. The night of the gathering, nearly 60 people showed up. The fire pit blazed. Laughter echoed across the trees. And we found ourselves surrounded by people who had all in one way or another suffered from Karen's madness and were now liberated by consequence. We hadn't planned to speak, but at one point someone handed my wife a mic and the crowd chanted her name, half in jest and half in sincere admiration. She walked to the center of the lawn, took a breath, and said, "All we did was stand our ground. Anyone here could have done it. We just happened to build a fence while she still thought the clipboard made her a queen." That got a round of applause and more than a few toasts. I followed it with a shorter line. Turns out all it takes to stop tyranny is a gate and a camera. The laughter was loud, but behind it was a genuine sense of relief. People were letting go of years of frustration, exhaling the weight of silence they'd been forced to carry while Karen ran wild with imaginary authority. That night, a neighbor brought a homemade banner that read Community 1, Karen 0, and someone stuck it in the grass like it was the flag of a reclaimed kingdom. Of course, Karen didn't attend, but that didn't mean she didn't notice. The next morning, as we walked back from Greg's place, still chuckling over some of the stories we'd heard, we found something new at the gate. A large envelope taped to the post with no name and no return address, but Karen's energy all over it. Inside was a letter handwritten this time, shaky script, dripping with passive-aggressive undertones. She didn't apologize, not outright. She never would. But the letter danced around something that resembled concession. She claimed she regretted the escalation, that she had been misled by outdated documents and hoped we would consider restoring peace for the sake of the mountain. My wife read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope and slipped it into the drawer labeled Karen Artifacts. We didn't respond, not out of pettiness, but because peace doesn't need negotiation. It just needs to be protected. And we'd already done that. A few days later, we made the decision to finally deal with Karen's SUV. It had been sitting inside our fence for so long, it had practically turned into a yard sculpture. But now, with the court ruling behind us, and Karen's options dried up, we had the authority to declare it abandoned. So, we filed the paperwork with the county, sent the formal notice, and gave the legally required waiting period. Karen never responded. Not a word, not a gesture, not even a new drone. And when the waiting period expired, we arranged for its removal. A flatbed truck arrived mid-morning. The driver was a quiet man who asked no questions, just nodded when we pointed out the car, then loaded it with the kind of practiced precision that made the whole thing feel oddly symbolic. We watched as the SUV disappeared down the road, a trail of dust in its wake, and something deep inside us loosened like a knot being untied. It was over for real this time. But we didn't stop there. Inspired by the community and frankly a little amused by our own unexpected reputation, we started making upgrades. We installed a weatherproof camera hub to streamline all the feeds. We added a small bookshelf on the porch labeled Legal Defense Library with copies of property laws, trespass codes, and laminated HOA boundaries. We even named the fence. A small sign at its base now read the line of sanity. It wasn't about gloating. It was about marking a moment in time when everything shifted. When silence turned into resistance, when community replaced compliance. When a couple on a mountain cabin proved that one person's entitlement couldn't bend reality forever. The community energy didn't fade either. People started helping each other more. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years began organizing cleanup days, trail restorations, and even a shared toolshed initiative. The HOA, now operating under new leadership, restructured its guidelines, installing a transparency committee and publicly disavowing Karen's previous interpretations of the rules. One of the new board members even reached out to us privately to apologize for years of unchecked behavior. We thanked him but made it clear we didn't want involvement. Our land would remain HOA-free, fence intact, gate closed unless invited. He understood. Everyone did. That was the beauty of it. We didn't need to scream to make a statement. We just had to endure long enough for the truth to outlast the noise. By the end of the month, our cabin had become a sort of quiet legend. Visitors who passed through town would ask where the famous fence was. Someone uploaded our story to a legal blog which reposted it on social media, and suddenly our gate was part of a digital thread titled Top 10 Petty Legal Wins of the Year. We laughed when we saw it, but it also reminded us of the importance of staying vigilant. Karen hadn't vanished. She had simply been muted by reality. And while we doubted she would try anything again, not with the entire county watching, we knew her type never truly let go. So we kept the cameras on. We checked the motion sensors. We stayed ready, not because we were afraid, but because preparation had always been our quiet superpower. Autumn came softly, painting the forest in amber and rust, wrapping the mountain in a kind of golden hush that made it hard to believe it had ever echoed with screaming voices or the clatter of misplaced authority. The mornings were crisp, our breaths rising in little clouds as we walked the fence line. Not out of fear anymore, but out of routine. The kind of peaceful rhythm that comes only after a long battle ends, and the silence no longer feels like the space before another fight, but the reward that follows the last one. We had made no big announcements, held no victory parade, and never once reopened the gate for symbolic closure. There was no need. The fence stood just as it had since the day we sealed it, sturdy, elegant, and humming with the quiet power of something earned. Karen had vanished. Not literally, of course. We still heard whispers that she was living in the same house down the hill, occasionally spotted by others during her grim grocery runs, her sunglasses lower, and her voice quieter than ever before. But she never returned to the gate, not once. And that more than any ruling or sanction was the real proof that something inside her had broken the moment we refused to bend. What changed in the weeks that followed wasn't just the scenery or the temperature. It was the way we lived. My wife, who once used to look over her shoulder every time she went to tend the garden, now hummed as she watered the planters. Her straw hat tilted against the rising sun. Her footsteps light like someone who had reclaimed something stolen. I spent more time in the woods again, carving trails, chopping wood, sitting still beneath trees just to listen to the birds that used to scatter during Karen's outbursts. We took naps on the porch without feeling like we were under surveillance. We grilled in the open without checking for binoculars. We played music at sunset that wasn't drowned by shouting about imaginary codes. And more than once we sat side by side in the cool evening light, holding hands and saying nothing at all because the silence itself had become the loudest proof that we'd won. But there was one thing left, one final act not of revenge, but of closure. And it began with an idea so small and silly we nearly dismissed it as a joke. We were sipping coffee one morning, a light mist curling over the treetops, when my wife said, "What if we made it a garden?" I blinked. A garden? She smiled. The space where her SUV sat all that time. It's just sitting there now. We should plant something. Turn the ugliest part of this whole story into something beautiful. I looked toward the clearing inside the fence, once occupied by a vehicle that symbolized so much chaos, and realized she was right. It wasn't about landscaping. It was about transformation, about reclaiming even the physical scars left behind. So, we cleared the area, laid down compost and fresh soil, and over the course of 2 weeks built a small circular garden where the tires once pressed into the earth. We planted lavender and rosemary, wildflowers that attract butterflies, and a cherry tree right in the center. Around it, we placed 4 smooth stones, each engraved with a single word: boundaries, respect, patience, peace. No signs, no plaques, no need for anyone else to understand. It was our reminder that from madness, something gentle could still grow. The community continued to flourish in ways we hadn't expected. The HOA, reformed and humbled, started hosting public Q&A sessions instead of issuing blanket notices. They even passed a new transparency bylaw named unofficially the Karen Clause, which required all complaints and fines to go through a verifiable process with physical evidence. At one session, a board member joked, "If your complaint starts with, 'I just feel like,' it doesn't qualify anymore." The crowd laughed, not with cruelty, but with catharsis, because laughter had replaced the fear that used to rule the neighborhood. People were no longer isolated behind closed blinds. There were block parties now, shared harvest tables, and spontaneous fire pit nights where neighbors traded tools and recipes instead of stories of who'd been targeted next. We stayed slightly apart by choice, not out of coldness, but because we had fought our war, and our home had become our sanctuary. But every so often, someone would stop by with a pie or a bottle of wine, or just to thank you, and we always welcomed them with open arms and quiet smiles. The legend of the fence still lived on, occasionally exaggerated, occasionally joked about, but always remembered with a tone of admiration we hadn't expected. One kid even asked if he could do a school project on the couple who beat the HOA boss. My wife laughed and handed him a stack of laminated copies of our land deed, saying, "Lesson 1, know your rights." The kid's parents sent us a thank you note. The project got an A. But the most surprising moment came one afternoon in early November when a small white envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a card, just a blank elegant card with 7 words scrolled in the center. "I finally understand. I hope you do, too." No signature, but we knew the handwriting, the phrasing. It was Karen. My wife read it aloud once, then tucked it into the back of the Karen artifacts drawer and closed it for good. "That's all the closure we'll get," she said, "and all we need." And she was right. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement. And even if it came too late to undo the harm, it came early enough to mark an ending. Winter arrived with the hush of snowfall blanketing the woods, and with it came a calm that didn't feel temporary anymore. The cabin glowed at night with warm light and soft music. And sometimes I would sit on the porch with a blanket and a cup of cider, watching the fence catch the moonlight, thinking of everything it represented. Not just protection, not just property, but proof that quiet people can win without shouting. That humor can survive even the most ridiculous conflict, and that the best kind of revenge is living well in a place someone once tried to steal with rules they didn't have the power to write. And when spring returned, as it always does, the cherry tree in the center of the garden bloomed with soft pink petals, dancing in the wind like confetti from a celebration we never officially threw. We stood beside it one morning, hands in the dirt, butterflies landing on the lavender, and I asked my wife if she thought it was all really over now. She didn't answer right away. She just looked up at the tree, its branches reaching quietly skyward, and said, "I think it's just beginning." And somehow that made sense because this wasn't a story about fences or property lines or HOA politics. It was a story about choice, about choosing peace over retaliation, dignity over chaos, and permanence over the noise of temporary storms. The mountain had watched it all. And now it stood with us, quiet, strong, rooted, just like the garden we built, just like the life we protected, and just like the fence that never moved even when the world around it tried to scream it down.